Hi, welcome to this video where I'm going to be looking at one of two topics that are covered on the same worksheets for my students. First one I'm going to look at is marginal costing in relation to make or buy, and then there'll be a separate video which will look at marginal costing and accepting orders, and also on there there'll be some theory comparing marginal costing and absorption costing. Okay. Make or buy tends to be mainly related to, in exam questions, to production firms. It can be related to any firm because many firms outsource things like HR functions, even certain accounting functions. So, for example, there are firms out there that specialize in doing pay calculations, and a lot of firms, regardless of the type of firm, might outsource doing pay slips, calculating pay to a specialist company. However, it's more likely to be in an exam question a manufacturing company. So the sort of things we're looking at, and I found this diagram here for the iPhone. Apple don't make that many of the components that go into an iPhone. What they specialize in is designing iPhones, and in some cases they will design the components, but most of those components are made by a specialist manufacturer, and for the majority of iPhones they are also manufactured or assembled by specialist assembly companies. So for example, here, if we're looking at the iPhone, well, the glass screens, the Wi-Fi chip, and the audio chips do all come from the USA. So some of those may be made by Apple themselves. However, the accelerometer, whatever that is, that comes from Germany. That'll be outsourced completely. Apple will outsource the manufacture of the battery to China. The camera, compass, and the LCD screen, they are outsourced and purchased in Japan, and the gyroscope in Switzerland. The reason why firms do it is obviously money. Specialist manufacturer of components may well have the economies of scale to reduce the cost of production, and they will also have the specialities and skills to make those particular components well. And it's difficult to build up that knowledge and those skills within a company. So I've made up a scenario here. We'll have a look at what a business would do. We've got AIB radios, currently produce radios, and they received an offer to buy transistors from a company in Japan. And transistor type 1, they can buy those in from Japan for $2 a transistor, and the transistor type 2, they can buy that in for $5. And what we've also got here is the information on both the labor and the material costs for transistor 1 and transistor 2, and an overhead absorption rate per transistor for the fixed costs. So if we look across here at the fixed costs of these two components, okay, we just need to obviously add up the variable costs and the fixed cost. Transistor 1 comes in at $3.50 to manufacture, and transistor 2 is costing the business $5.50 to manufacture. But on the face of it, both these transistors, therefore, should be purchased from Japan. If we look at a bit more detail at the marginal or variable costs, and we'll call it marginal costs here because that's we're looking at marginal costing. When we look at the marginal cost, what we will find is that transistor 1, the marginal stroke variable cost of manufacture at $2.50, which is also more than the cost of buying in transistor 1. So definitely transistor 1 would say yes, that looks good for outsourcing. With transistor 2, The marginal costs of production are only $4.50, and yet it will cost $5 to buy in. The reason why it becomes more expensive to make is because there is overhead that is allocated to that product. And that's something then that the business needs to think carefully about, because there are three possible scenarios really. One is it's possible that all the overheads that get absorbed are only associated with that product, in which case the business could get rid of that overhead. So they might be renting a small factory, and that small factory only manufactures transistor 2. And if they were to stop producing transistor 2, then that $1 would disappear, in which case outsourcing would be a good idea. However, if those overheads are shared overhead, for example, all the transistors are made in one factory, then all that would happen is if we stop manufacturing transistor 2, that overhead would need to be reallocated to all the other products that are manufactured. Okay, so the business would need to look carefully in that scenario. Okay, obviously, if the total cost of manufacture is more than the cost of buying in the component, from a financial point of view, it would always be worth doing. Now, it's not quite that straightforward as well, particularly if you get an exam question and in the real world. So let's look at some of the things that we need to consider and some of the rules for making or buying a product. Okay, the first rule is basically marginal cost is greater than the buy-in, then it's always, in terms of a financial answer, going to be worth accepting the offer to buy it in. If the marginal cost is less than the buy-in, but the total cost is greater, then we need to consider the buy-in and look carefully at our fixed costs, their elimination or reduction, or how sharing those fixed costs between other products is going to affect their price. And it will almost certainly, it will definitely increase their price if we cannot reduce or eliminate the fixed costs. Okay, there are other financial considerations that you should look at whenever you're doing anything to do with make or buy. And it'd be quite common for you to have to write about this as well in an exam question. The first thing that you need to consider is, have any additional costs to do with outsourcing being considered? It's not quite as straightforward as we either produce it ourselves or get somebody else to produce the product. Okay, if we buy product from somebody else, then have we got to transport it either from the supplier to our own premises, or have we got to receive it in our premises and pay the cost of the warehousing for storage, or indeed have we got to pay for the supplier to ship those goods to our final customer? So make sure all those additional costs for transport, storage, etc. have been considered. Have costs such as redundancy for work, I should say workers actually, being considered and factored in. So if we're going to reduce our production, we are going to lose workers. If those workers have been with us for a number of years, have we got to pay them money for severing their contract? And has the reduction of fixed costs been considered, and the impact on other outputs been considered if we can't eliminate those fixed costs? Okay, so they would be financial considerations over and above that sort of straightforward, what does a marginal cost look like, what does the total cost look like, and what is the buy-in? And there's also some non-financial considerations that in reality could become serious financial considerations for a business. So if we make some workers redundant because we're outsourcing, then what's going to be the impact on the rest of the workforce? Is morale going to fall? Are people going to start looking for new jobs that we don't want to lose? Is it going to be more difficult to recruit? Okay, redundancy can have a negative impact on a business's reputation, both locally and nationally. And we'll talk about how that can be sort of magnified in this type of scenario later on. But if people look on it negatively, are they going to be less likely to buy our product? What's going to be the impact on the quality of the product if you're no longer producing it? And again, that can actually lead into some costs. So, for example, I have a friend who works as a quality manager for Bentley, who make nice motor cars in the UK. And his job is to go around factories all over the world, looking at their manufacturing processes to validate that there is sufficient quality on the parts that they buy from all over the world to meet with the criteria that Bentley have for their high standard cars. So not only will it be negative if these parts or whole products that you buy in are not of the same quality as you make yourself, but there will also be an implication on your quality department of outsourcing production, and maybe once a year somebody having to fly to Japan or the US. Once production is outsourced, will the costs increase? These are called tempter prices. They used to be quite common, where a business that one attended to outsource within 2 years would perhaps double the costs, and all of a sudden it would have been cheaper to continue producing the product in the company itself, because it's phenomenally difficult to restart production when skills have been lost. Okay, negative impact on the business of outsourcing where work conditions are poor. So there's been a lot of recent examples where high-profile companies have outsourced production to various countries, and then, for example, it's been found that there have been 5-year-olds working in the factories where these products are now made, and that goes down very badly in Western countries, particularly where child labour is seen as being obviously very, very negative thing. Loss of quality control, I've already spoken about that. Greater lead times leading to increased inventory. So what we mean there is, what we mean by lead time is how long it takes from placing an order to actually receiving it. So if you manufacture goods in the country where you sell them, you don't need to worry about how long it takes for those goods to get from factory overseas. And that lead time might be significant. It might be 8 to 10 weeks. For example, if you're purchasing in China and you're a company in the UK. And that means that there will always be inventory transiting around the world, coming into your factory or your warehouse that belongs to you, and that inventory will tie up a large part of your cash. And it also makes it difficult to respond to short-term changes in demand. That was something that was found during the start of the COVID-19 epidemic. Companies placed orders that maybe had got a 10-month lead time, or 10-week lead time, and by the time those goods were reaching particular countries, all the shops in those countries were shut down. So if you were in the UK, for example, and you'd ordered your spring clothing collection, that was a big problem, because for the most of spring, UK shops were closed, and therefore they couldn't sell those goods, and they couldn't respond quickly to that short-term change in demand. And the final thing really is, I should have put in here about currency changes. Okay, how would increases and decreases in currency affect the outsourcing? So it might be a great idea, for example, to outsource to Thailand today from the UK. because the pound might be strong against the Thai baht. But if the pound weakens, then the cost of buying those goods in Thailand increases in terms of pounds, and therefore the goods might actually become more expensive than those goods in the UK. Right, thank you very much for listening. There'll be a second video shortly that will consider order acceptance and also look at comparing absorption costing and marginal costing. If I teach you, please do the worksheet that's been set, and obviously email me if you've got any questions. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.